Life's a loose cannon as the cameras roll. All the world's a suffering nest, aching souls. Mr. No keeps jang in his greying clothes. Out here at the edge of the fire, planning to shame, planning to blame, it's all true. I said planning to pain all this tiresome game, lived out by you, lived out by you.
Hello, and welcome to the School of Enlightened Selfishness. And we're going to look at the questions of transformation. On the first question is, who's in charge? I mean, who's in charge? There is no question that is more important to a human being. There is no question more important. You know, we have been looking at the proper development of a nine-centered being, what it means to be raised correctly. And what we saw is that from birth to Saturn, that this is an extraordinary phase in a human being's life, because it is, in fact, in this phase that one does find out who's in charge. Let's take a look at the world around us. Take a look at the human beings that you know in this life. Look out there in the world. Go up to any individual being and ask them who's in charge. You know, who's in charge of your life? Who's in charge of this and that? See, everybody in this life is trained to give up authority from the moment that they come into the world. Everybody in this life is trained to give up their authority the moment they come into the world. Now, obviously, when you first come into the world, you are helpless in that sense. And obviously, out of that helplessness and out of that dependency, you look to the natural authority that is going to nurture you. When we think about the nature of the homogenized world, we take that natural shifting of authority, this nurturing authority that is there to help the young come into the world, and we keep that as a fixed pattern throughout life. The child, in essence, is never given its own authority. It is simply controlled by layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of authority. Think about what it means to be a not-self being. Think about what it means for the not-self being who lives in their mind and who has given authority to their mind. Think about everything that is there within the context of understanding the basic mechanics of human design. The way in which the not-self mind operates, the way in which most human beings' minds operate, is that they operate in relationship to the conditioning they receive through their openness. Through their openness. It is through your openness that you meet the other. So your mind is based entirely on the conditioning that you receive from other human beings. It means in the moment that you think that you're making a decision as your own authority, in fact, you are not, never have been, never will. Because it's all based on the layers and layers of authority that you have taken in that have controlled the very nature of your life. I mean, who do you trust? Who do you rely on to keep you alive? Who do you rely on to give you that sense of well-being? Who do you rely on for all of those things that you think that you need? It is the other, and to the other you give that authority. Human beings are always giving away their authority. They do it all the time. They don't have any authority of their own. Think about the child that is raised correctly. They go through 4 phases in the first Saturnian cycle. 4 phases. Each phase approximately 7.5 years. These are cellular cycles built into the Saturnian framework. Each of these phases in the development, each of these quarters of the rotation and movement of Saturn around the sun, each of these phases brings that human being closer and closer to the threshold of what it is for them to be their own authority. In the first 7 years, the authority naturally is given to the parent. This is why we have such a great dilemma in terms of the nature of the well-being of human beings on this planet. If your parents are deeply conditioned beings, if your parents are unaware, if your parents have no idea whatsoever who you are or how you should be treated other than the way in which they think they see you, then you're going to end up being a deeply homogenized being. And those first 7 years are not simply to give you the tools that you need to be able to survive on this plane, but set you up for conditioning for the rest of your life. Do as you are told. It is something that every child hears. It is not that children are asked, they are told. Authority is something that parents claim. They claim. And they do not like ever to let go of it. But this is not the nature of the nine-centered being. The nine-centered being is not here to be nourished, to be a sheep. That every time it's in trouble, it looks around for somebody to save it. That every time it's confused, it's looking somewhere else. Every time it doesn't understand, it's looking somewhere else. That every time it stands in front of the mirror, it is convinced that what is there is hollow and shallow. Because it doesn't stand comfortably on its own feet. It long ago has given away its authority. Its authority. You know, I've had the privilege in my career to teach at many, many levels. And I think one of the most fascinating levels of teaching was something I did in the early 80s, teaching in a country school here in Ibiza. Watching the way children condition each other. Watching the way authority becomes group authority, peer authority. How the identity of any individual child is lost the moment that they step into that conditioning field because everybody is trying to claim authority. Because that's what they see in the world. It's so interesting, the phenomena of the bully, isn't it? I mean, just about, any school history of anyone, includes that story about the bully. They're a classic example of the distortion that exists in the way in which children are raised. This deep, deep resentment, this dislike of constantly being bullied. Oh, it's more subtle in the way in which the not-self parent applies that kind of pressure to their child, but it is the same thing. They are bullied into submission, into giving up their authority. And those that do not give up that authority easily, they are punished until they do. Until they do. And what sad human beings they become. The human beings that, love for them is somebody that is going to be their authority. Somebody that is going to make them feel better about themselves because they can't feel good about themselves by themselves. And they can't. Because if you give up your authority, then what can you feel about yourself? It does not exist. When everybody can tell you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, when anybody can say jump and you jump, and I don't care if it's your mother, your father, your dog, your sister, it doesn't make any difference who it is, your God, your government, whatever. When you jump, you give up yourself. It's not about saying no to everything. It's about being respected as a being. See, everything about the nine-centered being is that the nine-centered being is here to display cognitive potential, awareness as a potential. You cannot be aware if you're not in charge. You can't. If everybody is ruling your life, if everybody is making decisions for you, if you do not even know how to make a decision as yourself in the first place, You've given over any possibility of what it is to be you to something else, to all those something elses, until at some point you break down and you wonder what happened to you. Well, you gave it all away long ago, from the very start. See, the proper development of a nine-centered being begins with something very simple. It begins with understanding that at the most basic physical, biological level, the great conditioner at the beginning of life is food. It's food. This is the great conditioner. You know, those tiny forms coming in on this plane, they need to be nurtured precisely according to their nature, and they're not, They're homogenized from birth. It's very easy to begin to take away somebody's authority when you strip away the very nurturing they need to have it. It's why it's so important to understand that dietary regimen is something that is absolutely essential for the well-being of any child coming in on this plane. It's about the development of their brain system. It's about the development of their neural potential. It's about the development of their cognition. And you see, the moment that you nurture that, the moment that you nurture correctness, it's not just simply a matter that there is an appropriate dietary regimen, whether conditions or circumstances for that child, but that the way in which you approach that being is one in which you have respect for them as a being. As a being. I mean, you know, these are just packages. You know, this is just the vehicle for another personality crystal, another ancient filtering to come into form again. Oh yes, on the surface there are all these things, I know. The construct of family, the way in which we have evolved as mammals, our relationship to our young, all of these things. But you know, we're not here to see in the way in which the seven-centered being saw things. We can look beneath the surface of the book, open up the pages and see inside. We can understand that that being that has come into our life has a frame through which it has its possibilities. And those possibilities, that potential is to be respected. It's not that you can teach a child their design in that first cycle. As a matter of fact, it isn't necessary to teach them in the second cycle. That is the first 14 years, 15 years. It is much more important to treat them correctly. If you have a projector child and you invite them to do things, invite them to get involved with things, if you treat them correctly, they are going to develop a healthy sense of self. If you have generator children and you ask them, they will develop a healthy sense of self. By the time they get to the Saturn half point, this is the most difficult time in a human being's development, particularly for the nine-centered being. By the time you reach 16 years of age, biologically you are mature within the seven-centered context, but you're nowhere near the maturity demanded by the nine-centered phenomena. The half-life of the nine-centered being is between 38 and 44 years of age. It is at this crucial point in the midpoint of this first Saturn cycle. This is when it is time to begin to introduce the principles. In other words, to begin to provide an educational direction for your child in relationship to themselves. Not an easy thing for any teenager to see they're not self. It is not. As a matter of fact, it can be deeply, deeply uncomfortable. The fact is that teenagers who will meet their not self, who have not been raised correctly, this is a deep shock for them because it reveals the duality and the falseness of their process, something that can make them feel very uncomfortable. But the child that's nurtured correctly, the child that is offered the proper dietary regimen, the regimen that is going to nurture the very capacities that they are going to need, a child that is dealt with correctly in terms of the interaction with its, with its family, that by the time that it gets to this midpoint, this is the time to begin to introduce the knowledge. And it's different, obviously. If you have a manifestor child, it isn't going to do you any good to try to get them to understand about themselves, because manifestors aren't interested in that. But if you explain to them that they can understand how they impact other people, their little ears will perk up, because this is what manifestors do. If you have a projector child, it's not about trying to get that projector child to understand who they are, because they're not going to enjoy that, because that's not what they're about. But to invite the projector child to look at its friends and understand how their mechanisms work. Whoa, is that ever going to turn on that projector? Generators, 2/3 of humanity, and 2/3 of those teenagers, they need to know about themselves. This is what they're designed for. Generators are here to know themselves. It is only through knowing themselves that truly they can fulfill their potential. Remember, everything about what it is to be a generator is about the proper use of energy. If you're not your own authority as a generator, your energy is being used, and it's being abused, and it's being wasted. And the byproduct of that is never very pleasant. It isn't. You see, who is in charge? For every human being, if you ask them, not that they would say their wife or their lover or their husband or their friend or whatever, because they wouldn't dare say that. They would say, I'm in charge. I'm in charge of my life. You ask just about anybody, that's what they'll really say to you. I'm in charge of my life. Of course I am, And who's saying that? That's their not-self mind. It's their not-self mind. That not-self mind is built on all the conditioning of all the people that they've ever dealt with. It is built on all the fears that they have. It is this not-self mind that says, I'm in charge. Okay, let's think about that. Let's say they have an open ego. And the open ego is all about, I have to prove myself. I'm unworthy and I have to prove myself. So they say, I'm in charge. And somebody asks them to do something that they don't want to do, that they hate doing, But they got an open ego and they feel unworthy. And they figure if they say no, that person's going to think that they're, a lowlife, And so they say, hey, I'm in charge. I'll do it. Yeah, right. You're in charge and you're going to do it. Isn't that what you say every day? Isn't it? I'm in charge. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. I'm going to do the next thing. You're not in charge at all. It's all that openness in you that's got you all wrapped up in what you're not. And your mind is so filled with the fear of what's going to happen to you in the next moment or in the next hour or in the next day. Nobody's in charge there. The program's running your life, like everybody else. The lemmings, What does it mean to be in charge? It goes back to the very premise of this knowledge. Everything about this knowledge is movement in space. Everything about it, because that's the truth. That is the truth. This is the true physics. Everything is moving in space. Everything about our existence is about navigating. Those navigations are so subtle, and yet they make the whole difference in the life. Do you do this or do you do that? If you do that, you're gone over there. And if you do this, you're gone over there. These are different tracks, different journeys. And if you're going that way, you see what you see over there. And if you're going this way, you see what you see over there. But you don't get the other. And how do you decide between this and that? You who thinks you're in charge. I'm in charge. I'm going to go that way. Why? Is it because of your open ego and you want to prove that you're worthy? Is it because of your open spleen that you're just holding on to the same old stuff? Is it because you got an open G and you're lost and you think you'll find something over there? Is it because you got an open Ajna center and you're pretending that you're certain that that's the way? You don't know because you're not in charge. You're not capable of being in charge. Mind is not. Oh, mind is beautiful in its place. In its place. And its place is not driving the vehicle. It doesn't know where to go. And it means you're never in charge of your life. So you don't get what's there for you. You don't. You don't get to see what's possible. You don't. See, the only way that you can be in charge is by turning over the authority in your life to your vehicle. And it's only about decision making. Remember that. It's only about decision making. The moment that there is a decision in front of you, it has to come out of your inner authority. Otherwise, you are not navigating as yourself. And if you are not navigating as yourself, you are never going to get to that destination that is your right. It is the only way you can be in charge of your life. The only way. It is the only way that you can be fulfilled in this life. This is the school of enlightened selfishness. Enlightened selfishness. And enlightened not in the spiritual sense, but a selfishness that is not dark nor mean. It is a selfishness that begins with the fundamental truth that if you are not correct within yourself, you have no room, place, or ability to be able to deal with this world in any way that is going to fulfill you. It begins here, alone, inside. It is where it stays, always, alone, inside. You can only be transformed within yourself. And that transformation begins with the catalyst, the experiment of strategy and authority. It frees you to become you. It allows you for the first time in your life to discover that not only are you really in charge, but you're good at it. You're good at it. Because you begin to eliminate resistance. You begin to move along a trajectory that is truly your trajectory, and you get to see what is there for you. Nine-centered beings are not here to be afraid. They're not here to be afraid about whether or not they're going to survive on this plane. We are so much better equipped than that. But as long as you're no longer in charge, as long as you give up your authority to others, you're never safe. You're never safe. Look at the world around you. How unsafe most human beings feel in this world. You see, your only security comes from you. From you. You know, I teach self-love. You will only learn to love yourself when you see, in fact, that you're deeply competent to be able to operate on this plane, that you do not need this authority or that authority, that you can function according to what is correct for you. You see, this is the process of the first 30 years. It is this first half of the cycle in which the vehicle, the being is enriched at a physical level, is enriched at a psychological level in the way in which they are treated. And then in the second half of that Saturnian cycle, the beginning of understanding for them, making sense of, knowing, whatever the language and the circuitries, to begin to grasp what it truly means to be them, to begin to refine not what they were offered in their upbringing, but to begin to refine within themselves the use of their own authority, the deep, not even experiment, but evolution into being purely their own authority. So that by the time they get to the Saturn, that they can leave that Saturnian shell, that they can go out into the world, that they can find their place, that they can plant that cross, and they can begin their journey. But if you're not in charge, there is no journey waiting for you. None. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And thanks for participating, and to all of you, until next time, bye for now.
There goes Mr. No in his black attire, strung out between the word and guitar desires. Now you're at the edge of the fire, out here at the edge of the fire, out here at the edge